Right now, what the U.S. is doing is hitting, a boat here, a boat there. I don't think that'll do it. I think you need to hit Venezuela itself for the military to think, okay, the game's really over. Maduro's going down. I don't want to go with him.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Trump World. I'm Matt Frei in Washington.
And I'm Anushka Astana in Trinidad and Tobago. I'm not just here for the sunshine. I'll explain why I'm here in a minute. But I just wanted to encourage you to subscribe if you're enjoying this show, Trump World.
And if you do, or even if you don't, but especially if you do, you will find out what we're speaking about this week. And that is the extraordinary gunship diplomacy happening off the coast of Venezuela, courtesy of the American Navy. Now, while we've been focusing on trade tariffs and Epstein and all these other things, there's been this buildup of American military force off the coast of Venezuela. And the question is this gunship diplomacy, if it's diplomacy at all, designed to get rid of the regime, the president Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, something that Trump tried to do in his first term. But this time round, he's using military force or the threat of it. And he's very motivated by his Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, for whom this is a pet project.
The reason I'm in Trinidad and Tobago is we can't actually get into Venezuela right now. Access for journalists is very, very restricted. Trinidad and Tobago is Venezuela's closest neighbour on the Caribbean side. I actually got on a boat, staying very close to shore in a safe place, and went as close as I could. And you could really see how close Venezuela was, just 7 miles across the water. And the reason I'm here is that all of this is having a huge impact on Trinidad and Tobago. The Prime Minister here, to much anger across the country, is supporting what Donald Trump is doing. But we've got a situation where there are literally bodies washing up onto the shores of Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidadian nationals have been killed by these strikes. We had the 21st strike on a boat on Saturday. I think there are 83 people who have now died as a result of that. People very, very clear to me that this is a breach of international law. America isn't part of the International Criminal Court, but Trinidad and Tobago and the UK are, and there's implications for that, which we will come to when we discuss this. It has been a really fascinating few days talking to people here.
I mean, the reason why people are watching what America is doing, what Trump is doing with Venezuela very closely is, one, Venezuela, believe it or not, has the biggest oil reserves on the planet of any country, bigger than Saudi Arabia. It is also the second biggest has the second biggest reserves of natural gas in the Western Hemisphere. So it's stuffed with natural resources, something that Donald Trump would love to get its hands on. But also this idea of regime change, either through limited force or a threat of force, or perhaps even boots on the ground, which Donald Trump has said is a possibility. That is something that people are watching very closely because it set a precedent for other actions around the region or indeed across the world. We're going to speak to Elliott Abrams a little bit later. He was the Venezuela envoy in the first Trump administration. He knows a lot about the country. He knows a lot about Trump's motives, and we'll try and find out from him what is actually going on and how this is different to what they tried to do in the first Trump administration. But let's just see what Trump 2.0 had to say about Venezuela.
Is there anything you're ready to rule out at this point? Are you ruling out U.S. troops on the ground?
No, I don't rule out that. I don't rule out anything.
In these talks with Maduro, is there anything that he could say or do that would allow you to feel like he could stay with your support? Is there anything that he could say that you would be, okay, you can stay as leader?
The question's a little bit tricky. I don't think it was meant to be tricky. It's just that, look, he's done tremendous damage to our country, primarily because of drugs, but really because we have that problem with other countries too. But more than any other country, the release of prisoners into our country has been a disaster. He's emptied his jails. Others have done that also.
Obviously, we've been hearing responses from Nicolas Maduro himself. He has described the strikes in the sea as serial executions. Actually, there are even some Republicans in Congress who agree with him that these are extrajudicial killings. He did this slightly bizarre thing this weekend when he was talking about this. He suddenly broke out into a peace song, John Lennon's Imagine. And look, clearly there are big questions about Nicolas Maduro's regime. He is widely considered to have stolen last year's election. He lost to an opposition leader who was later given the Nobel Peace Prize, but he still carried on and seized control of the country. But massive questions about what America is claiming is going on here. They're claiming that by striking these boats in the Caribbean Sea, that they are trying to stop fentanyl getting into the US. It's very, very clear from just spending a few days here that this is not fentanyl that's coming through this particular route. And many of the drugs are actually going onto Europe and not going to the US. He's claimed that Maduro has emptied his jails to let immigrants come through to the US. Obviously, there's a lot going on here. Matt, you've already mentioned oil. Tell us what you think. Why do you think Trump hates Nicolas Maduro so much?
I think we have to go back even a little bit before Trump, because Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, who was the repeatedly elected president of Venezuela, who then became also its strongman, who was the predecessor to Nicolas Maduro, the current president, who was Hugo Chavez's vice president. Even when Chavez was in charge, America was very unhappy with Venezuela, because Venezuela became a sort of larger, newer Cuba in the Caribbean, not far from the United States, very much in America's backyard. He was completely over the top, unbelievably engaging, and hated by successive American administrations. And he was in charge from 1999 to 2013 when he died, hated because he was a thorn in America's side. And I remember going to his funeral in Caracas, and the lines were extraordinary, because this man had promised to lift very large numbers of people who were living in the slums around the city of Caracas, which is potentially a very beautiful place, lift them out of poverty and give them at least a chance of participating in the oil riches of Venezuela, which are extraordinary. This is the country that has as I said earlier, bigger oil reserves stuffed in its ground than Saudi Arabia, the second biggest natural gas reserves in the Western Hemisphere. The money that can be made there is extraordinary. Now, as you said, Maduro is a dictator. He literally stole the last election. There's just no doubt about it. Even people quite close to him are sort of admitting, yeah, it was a bit dodgy. And it was a result of that stolen election contested by a woman called Maria Corina Machado, who won the Nobel Peace Prize this year, not Trump, of course, so you have sort of three boxes that are being ticked here. Box number one, this woman Machado, who could be running Venezuela. And this is someone that Trump has congratulated about her Peace Prize. He's working very closely with her. She is bought totally into the Trump agenda. Box number two, you've got all these natural resources that Trump was actually very close to getting his hands on in a deal concocted earlier this year, whereby Venezuela would have literally handed over its entire natural resources wealth to the United States, even more than Ukraine was going to do in its minerals deal. And the third box is that they are highly motivated. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, is really going after the Venezuelan regime.
I just want to kind of rewind for a minute and try and explain how Donald Trump is selling this, because he's not selling it as as you have just basically set out. He's selling it with what sounds like an America First policy. And many believe that Marco Rubio basically persuaded Donald Trump, because he wants regime change in Venezuela, that it could be sold in this way. And he's selling it as an operation. They're calling it, they've just named it actually, Operation Southern Spear, that will save American lives. In fact, he argues that every strike on a boat will save 25,000 American lives.
Because of fentanyl, right?
Because of fentanyl, yeah. Although he's, as of yesterday, I think, started to mention cocaine as well. But you have to go back to day one of the Trump presidency to understand what's going on here. Because on day one, Donald Trump signed loads of executive orders, more than anyone had ever done before on day one of a presidency. One of them basically designated drug cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. And so the idea was that from that day on, they would treat these organizations a bit like they treated Al-Qaeda in the past, i.e. they could go out there and they could bomb them out of the skies. I mean, it's not even got as much oversight as when they went after Al-Qaeda, because at least when they went after Al-Qaeda, there had been a kind of military type attack on the US. And secondly, they got permission from Congress. This time, No, he doesn't bother with Congress. He just goes ahead. Now, all of that provided a justification to start bombing on September the 2nd, and they started striking boat after boat after boat that was coming from Venezuela. And look, it is fascinating to be here on the ground in Trinidad and Tobago. It's only 7 miles away by water. Boats are coming continuously across from Venezuela to Trinidad and Tobago. And I should say, without a shadow of a doubt, there is a big drug smuggling problem here. But speaking to people, and one of those peoples was a member of Trinidad's defense forces. He could only talk to me on condition of anonymity, but he made really clear to me that it's not fentanyl coming through here. What type of drugs are on the boats?
The drugs would mostly include a green plant-like substance.
Marijuana?
Right. Yeah, marijuana. There are lesser instances where a white powdery substance is found.
Cocaine?
Cocaine.
This isn't really a route for fentanyl.
Not particularly.
He warned the strikes clearly breached international law. Do you believe that the boats that have been struck had drug dealers on them?
I would like to believe that if a decision was taken to strike vessels, that decision was based on sound, reliable intelligence for someone to then decide, okay, we are 100% certain.
Do you believe they were 100% certain?
I don't think so.
And one thing that is really, really interesting, and it is really challenging for Trinidad and Tobago, where the Prime Minister has basically given Trump the green light, but it's also quite challenging to the UK. And I've been speaking to like military sources, intelligence sources, and also legal sources about all of this, which is America may not be a member of the International Criminal Court, but we are. And if Trinidad, more likely actually than the UK, provide intelligence that goes along the line and ends up with one of these strikes, then they become part of what is known as the kill chain. And if you are in the kill chain, then you are liable for what happens at the end of it. So if we provide intelligence that ends up with a strike, which I can promise you the UK and Trinidad and Tobago consider to be unlawful in international law, then you end up liable with the ICC. Now, there were reports that the UK was therefore withholding intelligence. The sources I speak to suggest that we don't have the intelligence that's really leading to these strikes. So as yet, it's not really an issue for us. But clearly, our government is monitoring this very closely. People here in Trinidad are really quite worried about the impact that this could have for them, the knock-on effect if they're providing the US with this intelligence.
And of course, the question really is, what do they actually intend to do in Caracas? I'm talking about the Americans here. And how do they intend to do it? So the impression is that, yes, they want regime change. They want to get rid of Nicolas Maduro, having actually tried to do a deal with him along these natural resources earlier in the year. But how's that going to work? Because America has a very dodgy record with regime change all over the world, but also in Latin America. It doesn't tend to go very smoothly with a great outcome for either side. And when you compare, let's say, Venezuela to Panama, where they did this in the late 1980s, Panama is a much smaller country. Venezuela is 10 times the size. They had thousands of troops inside Panama. I'm not sure Trump is prepared to do that. And even with a relatively limited operation like Panama, where they ended up capturing Manuel Noriega, partly because he'd taken refuge in the ambassador's residence of the Holy See, and they blasted the residence with heavy metal music for 10 days. They captured him. They put him on trial in Miami. He basically died in custody. But even in that clever, limited military operation, America lost something like 240 soldiers or so. Is Trump prepared to put boots on the ground in Venezuela, which is a much more tricky proposition? He hasn't said so, but he hasn't ruled it out either. And if you just have this pressure on the outside, remember that the Venezuelan regime has been living with American pressure for years. I mean, they tried something similar in a less concentrated, focused form in the first Trump administration. And even before that, Barack Obama wasn't exactly a friend of the Maduro government after he came into office in 2013. And of course, Venezuela is not alone. It has friends. The Chinese are its friends. The Russians have got involvement there. You've got, I think, the North Koreans knocking around a little bit. I mean, the Iranians as well. So they are still part of that, what the Americans used to describe as the axis of evil. I don't think this is quite the flashpoint that the Cuban Missile Crisis was in the 1960s. I can't imagine that we would go that far. But it's not entirely without consequences for the region. And the question always, Anushka, is, isn't it, how far is Trump prepared to go in order to take, to achieve his goals? How far is he prepared to take these risks? One other aside, Hugo Chavez, who was this extraordinary figure who I described earlier, in some ways is rather similar to Trump, because he used to have this program on Venezuelan state television called Allo Presidente, went out on Sunday night. It was open-ended, and he used to have to, the cabinet used to have to turn up, and then there was a live audience, and they used to have to listen to Chavez weave in and out of one subject after another, and he would read the papers and kind of leaf through the papers, and then he'd lose his place, and everyone just had to watch as this guy was bloviating and speculating and just boring the country to tears with his thoughts. And I have to say, that does remind me a little bit of Donald Trump's sort of cabinet meetings or Oval Office gaggles, where everyone just hangs on to every word and they just go on and on and on.
Donald Trump has got a domestic problem right now. And part of the domestic problem comes from him focusing so much on foreign conflicts around the world. I mean, he's fallen out in great style with Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is the kind of ultimate...
You mean Marjorie Traitor Greene? Marjorie Traitor Greene.
I mean, that's what he's calling her.
Yeah.
She is a representative who was about as MAGA as they come. She was a huge supporter of his, but she started to break away from him on various issues. The most obvious one, the release of the Epstein files. They have had a complete fireworks fallout, but I keep noting that one of the things she keeps saying is you're focusing on foreign policy when actually Americans are struggling. We've seen the Democrats do really well in recent elections because of economic situations, but there is clearly a desire for a very big geopolitical shift in South America. I mean, if you listen to experts on this, that the kind of narrative behind it, if you like, is that America wants to have more dominance in the Western hemisphere. We've seen them, offering plenty of money to friendly governments like Milei in Argentina, whilst they are trying to pressure the more left-wing socialist governments like Nicolas Maduro. It is interesting because, as we said, twice now, Maduro stole the election. There is not support for him in the country. Most people would like to see him gone. They voted for the opposition in last year's election. At the same time, there does not appear to be support for an invasion. I should say, while there has been this huge buildup of military might in this region, I know I'm sitting here in front of a curtain, but just outside are the waters exactly where that has been happening. And there are thousands and thousands of American soldiers nearing the Venezuelan borders. There is not enough people here to suggest that they're trying to do what they did in Panama. There's not enough to suggest that they would go ahead with a proper land invasion. It's very clear they're trying to scare Maduro, trying to get him out. Maybe there could be some sort of land strike. It's very possible. Trump has talked about that, or a kind of targeted thing at allies of Maduro that would make him want to leave the country. I just wonder if the American public really has the appetite for America being once again so focused on something outside of its borders. And particularly when the argument they've been making, and you can sort of hear Donald Trump shifting on this, doesn't stack up. Fentanyl is not coming on boats from Venezuela towards the Caribbean Sea. It is crossing the border from Mexico. That doesn't mean that there isn't an opioid crisis in America, and it doesn't mean that there isn't a drug smuggling problem here. But, and also, does striking boats actually deter people? Speaking to that senior member of the Defence Force here, they thought, it might deter them in the short term. People are very, very scared here. I was out with a fisherman yesterday who has lost more than half his income because he used to go 30 miles from Trinidad and Tobago right into those waters close to Venezuela, which is where the best shark can be caught. And, shark is a very big delicacy here in Trinidad and Tobago. Now he doesn't dare to go 10 miles. The catch has massively reduced. So this guy was saying, look, it will also deter fishermen on the one hand, which Trump, can you believe, has joked about fishermen being too scared to go there. These are people who are really struggling financially, and now, their livelihoods are being pulled from under them. It's also scaring drug gangs. But what that military source said to me is they are very, very resourceful. And actually, a fisherman who has been out on these waters for 40 years said, bit of hyperbole here, but said, in his opinion, they could strike 1 million boats and kill 1 million people, but the drugs would still come.
But remember, there's also the domestic dimension, and there always is with Latin American politics. So we know about the Cuban vote in what used to be the swing state of Florida, which is now Trump's residence, of course. Similarly, there's a Venezuelan vote. And during the last election, I spent a lot of time talking to Venezuelan Americans. They were all Trump supporters. And a lot of them were very upset that he started deporting Venezuelans as soon as he got back into office, even those who didn't have any criminal records. And for them, for the Venezuelan community, that was a promise broken. But the one thing they really care about, and that really unites Venezuelans of whatever generation, is that they all hate Nicolas Maduro, the president. So I wouldn't be surprised if part of the calculation, but only one part, is let's do the Venezuelans who are feeling a bit bruised by what we've done with immigration. Let's do them a favor and try and get rid of Maduro, which is something they will thank us for forever. As Cuban Americans would have thanked successive American administrations if they had succeeded in getting rid of the Castro brothers, which they didn't. But remember this, Anushka, you get rid of Maduro, and if you don't have a smooth transition to the next, in other words, if Maria Corina Machado does not manage to create a viable, coherent, democratic, peaceful Venezuela, big question mark, then guess what's going to happen? You're going to have more Venezuelan refugees leaving the country. There might even be a knock-on effect to Colombia next door, and you have Colombian refugees heading across Central America. So you could actually make the problem that they set out to solve by putting up a fence or a wall on the border even worse if you're not careful. If this thing gets out of hand, and often these regime change exercises, as we saw in Iraq, get horribly out of hand.
We should also be very skeptical of the real motive, as you have been, and I totally agree with you. I don't think that Donald Trump is crying because an election was stolen in Venezuela last year. I think what he doesn't like is that the election was stolen by a socialist, so somebody whose politics are different. But as you say, he was nearly doing a deal with Maduro not that long ago over Venezuelan oil, in which Venezuela would give up almost all of it. And everyone I've spoken to here is really clear that is the major, motivation here. It's not really about trying to help the Venezuelan people. They would argue it's really about trying to remove an anti-American leader and replace them with a pro-American leader who will do that deal. And just this week, Donald Trump has said, maybe I will talk to Nicolas Maduro, as we heard earlier. So if he does talk to him, maybe he's hoping that all this pressure will actually result in the deal that he wants, and then he will back off. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that in the meantime, America is behaving in the way that America has long criticized regimes across the world for behaving. It is taking out people on boats. I met the family of one of the men who was killed, a guy called Chad Joseph. And I was saying to them, no one told them, no one informed them that their, loved one had been killed. Frantic calls went unanswered. They found out on social media. And I asked them about the drugs thing. I mean, they said if he was involved in drugs, where were his assets? Which I thought was quite interesting, because at the very least, the people who are on these boats, if they are involved in the drug trade, are largely probably very low down the chain. They're not exactly the leaders of drug gangs. But the bigger point is, even if these boats were to be shown, all of them, to have drugs on board, you don't just go and kill people without providing the evidence. You don't go and kill people without due process.
But yes, I know that is true. It's a very important point, and I think that's what many people are worried about, including in this country, although none of them are members of the Trump administration. I mean, the Trump administration would point to Barack Obama, who had a kill list of Islamic extremists, terrorists, who were taken out on a very regular basis, and it had to be done. A judge had to sign off on the kill list, but we were never told who was on the kill list. People just wound up dead. There was never any due process. Do you think that
this is a quite interesting point, though? Do you think that the war on terror can be equated with the war on drugs? I mean, that's basically what they're saying. The war on terror, they would argue.
I think any war on a noun is always a problem, right? So the war on terror was, led to Guantanamo Bay, You could argue that, bits of it were Abu Ghraib. I mean, America did terrible things as a result of conducting a war on terror in the same way that the war on drugs, which has been going on for decades, started under Ronald Reagan and Noriega, removed by Bush Sr., otherwise a sort of, the former CIA operative, head of the CIA, a relatively genteel man compared to his son, he went after Noriega again because of drugs. Now, there may have been more evidence to link Noriega to drug trafficking back in the day than there is to link Maduro to the drugs cartels selling stuff from Venezuela. We don't know because we're not being told. And again, you always have to remember that whatever Trump does in this sort of impatient presidential mind is to keep himself busy and occupied, but also to deflect from something else. So the Epstein files, the fact that the cost of living crisis has been made worse by tariffs, tick, 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 as we discussed just a few weeks ago, in the so-called blue wave when the Democrats won 2 states and, of course, Mamdani won in New York, a lot of that is down to the fact that Trump has not been able to fix the problems he came into office to fix. So what do? You deflect by going on foreign adventures. What does the MAGA base do? As you said, they complain. They said America first is about America first, not let's deal with Venezuela first. And I think so he's getting himself into some hot political water on a number of levels. We say farewell to Anushka, who's off to cover another story, but we say hello to Elliott Abrams, who is the Venezuela envoy in the first Trump administration, is now a senior fellow in the Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome, Elliott.
Good to be here.
So a lot to unpack here. What do you think ultimately is going on with the administration parking this fleet off the coast of Venezuela and making, threatening noises to Nicolas Maduro, killing all these people who they accuse of ferrying drugs to America? Is this about regime change? Is it about reducing the flow of drugs? Is it about influence in the hemisphere? What's it about?
Well, it certainly is about reducing the flow of drugs, but you don't need a gigantic aircraft carrier to do that. So I assume it is also about getting rid of Nicolas Maduro.
Right. And of course, you were in charge of the Venezuela policy in the first Trump administration. And, he made some very unkind noises about Trump, that is, about Maduro at that time. But what is different this time? Because it seems to be a very different policy, a more robust one.
Well, it certainly is. In the first term, we used, diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, sanctions, but no military pressure. One thing is different, and that is that they've now had an election. And it was a landslide defeat for Maduro. And there is a legitimately elected president. The problem is that that's probably the thing that Trump cares about least when you compare it to, say, drug trafficking. So the major difference is probably not the explanation for this change. And I don't really understand what is.
And if you don't understand, Elliott, we're in trouble, aren't we? Because you know about policy towards Venezuela, you know about policy towards Latin America in the broader sense. Just tell us about the thing that we've been discussing on the podcast, which is this idea that there was a deal to be made with Maduro, between Maduro and Trump at the beginning of the administration. And it was around natural resources. Essentially, Venezuela was going to hand over almost all of its oil to America in return for America tolerating Maduro in power. Did you hear of such a deal, and what happened to that deal?
Yes, Maduro offered something along those lines. It's not a very compelling offer. We don't actually need Venezuelan oil. We did during the Second World War, but we're pretty much self-sufficient in oil these days. To the extent that this is about migration, and that's an issue that we should really mention, it's pretty clear that while Maduro is in power and destroying the economy of Venezuela and repressing the people, they're going to keep moving out of Venezuela. So if you want that to stop, you really got to change the regime.
But regime change is something that America has tried, not just in Latin America over the decades, but also most famously in Iraq. And it doesn't always go according to plan. How, if there is a regime change plan that you can decipher out of all this, what does it actually look like?
Venezuela is a much better candidate than, say, Iraq or Syria. When we think of Syria, we think of and Iraq, Sunnis and Shias and Druze and Kurds. There are no divisions like that in Venezuela, first of all. Secondly, Venezuela had about 50 years of democracy. They kicked out a military dictator in 1958. And then for about 50 years, it had, regular elections and democracy. So there's a much better possibility that after Maduro, they could return with their recently elected president to democracy. You can't say regime change. I mean, this administration hates that term, and they'll never use it, and they'll deny it. But I think the idea basically is if you could get Maduro and his inner circle out, and then Edmundo Gonzalez, who was elected president and is in exile in Spain, would go home, you could start returning Venezuela to democracy.
Because the issue in Iraq was always that, you could have free and fair elections, sort of, but you don't have the institutions of democracy to uphold the democracy, to uphold the result. Did those institutions survive, decades of Chavez and Maduro?
Yes and no. I mean, there's always been a parliament, but the elections for parliament were in recent years fixed. There's always been a Supreme Court, and a court system, but again, under the control of the regime. And the question is, how long would it take to restore those? Again, Venezuela had 50 years of this. It is surrounded by democracies like Brazil, Chile, Peru, Colombia. So it is, no guarantees, but it is a better candidate.
Right. But I guess we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. First of all, to establish democracy, you've got to, remove the guy who's currently running the country. Do you really think that, given what awaits him, Nicolas Maduro is open to some kind of deal that, sees his removal from power, or even open to gunship diplomacy, with the USS Gerald Ford parked off the coast of his country? I just can't imagine that really working. I wonder if you can.
It is reminiscent of what happened in Panama with Manuel Noriega. The deal that was offered, this is the Reagan administration, we'll quash the indictments of you if you will leave power and leave Panama. He said no and ended up in a U.S. federal prison. I think really Maduro is unlikely to accept such a deal because he's worried about going to prison himself. He is an indicted drug trafficker, indicted in the U.S. That's why I think you're going to have to push him out. You're probably not going to be able to negotiate him out. And that means getting, among other things, getting Venezuelan military to push him out. Some colonel someplace to rise up and say, look at this American power being brought here. I do think it will require strikes on Venezuela. That is, right now what the U.S. is doing is hitting, a boat here, a boat there in international waters. I don't think that'll do it. I think you need to hit Venezuela itself, some military or narcotics target for the military to think, okay, the game's really over. Maduro's going down. I don't want to go with him.
Okay, but some colonel somewhere could be another Hugo Chavez, couldn't it? I mean, that he was some colonel somewhere. He ended up taking over the whole country.
Yeah, but now they've got an elected president, and this is in the context, of course, of tremendous use of American power. The Maduro and his regime are reviled all over Latin America, and the days of Latin American, juntas running countries are over. There isn't a military dictatorship in all of Latin America.
And, but you mentioned the Noriega example in, I think it was 1989. I mean, there were American boots on the ground. That is something that Trump has said, and his MAGA movement has said they really don't want to see.
Right. And I don't think he's going to do it. Reagan tried negotiating with Noriega. That failed. It was George H.W. Bush then in 1989, as you said, who invaded Panama. That is the kind of thing Trump hates. He likes, the kind of thing he did in Iran, a strike and then it's over with no boots on the ground. I don't think you're going to see that. And it's interesting that if you look at this great flotilla, yeah, there are some troops there, but there are not the numbers that you would need for Venezuela. He does not intend that, I think.
So if he wants the Venezuelan people, the opposition, of which there are millions, to do the heavy lifting, as he thought maybe might be the case in Iran, well, again, that didn't work. They didn't do the heavy lifting. They were either too intimidated or too disorganized to do so. Do you think that Venezuela is different because there is a coherent opposition that formed around the last election that was stolen by the president?
I think it's different. I think that, however, you will probably need something coming from the Venezuelan military to push Maduro out. I think the idea that you're going to get 5 million people out, into the streets to do this, pretty unlikely.
Just on the question of bombing these, boats, fishing boats that carry drugs. I mean, in all this stuff, there's no due process of law, is there? We just have to take it on, on their evidence that these are boats carrying fentanyl. And actually, Anushka was on the ground in Trinidad and spoke to people there. They're right across the water from Venezuela. They said the evidence so far is that it's actually not. It's marijuana. It might be cocaine, but it's not fentanyl. I mean, is there a problem here that America is just doing all these extrajudicial killings without going to any due process of law, and that might set a rather alarming precedent?
Well, I think a lot of Americans feel that way. I do think these boats are engaged in drug trafficking. Fentanyl, as you said, doesn't come to the U.S. this way. It comes across the Mexican border. But this is mostly cocaine. Cocaine does come from Colombia and Venezuela. These were not fishing boats. These were not tourist boats. This was drug trafficking. Nevertheless, we've been handling this for years and years by having the Coast Guard stop the boat and arrest people and then bring them to court and let's see if you can convict them. This is something new. Will President Trump get away with it? Yes, I think he will get away with it.
Do you approve?
No, I don't approve. Look, I don't approve of drug trafficking. I think these people belong in jail. But I think they also need a trial before they're killed.
Is there any evidence, as the administration has suggested, that Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, is the head of a gang, of a cartel, of a drugs cartel?
Yes, and I think that his regime really, at the very least, protects the drug traffickers and lives off the profits of drug trafficking. So I think he's in it, and I think really everyone who investigates it, he's in it up to his neck.
And is the idea that you change Venezuela, you get rid of Maduro, as you said, through the elements of the Venezuelan military, opposition on the ground, the people who were elected but who had the election stolen from them. And does that then is it supposed to send a message to the rest of the continent? We can do it here. We can also do it over there.
Well, I think it's supposed to send a message to Cuba and Nicaragua. In fact, Maduro has, all of his years in power, been giving somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 barrels a day of oil to Cuba for free. Cuban economy is in bad shape. If you had a Democratic government that stopped that subsidy, that regime might fall too. And the regime in Nicaragua, I think, is also very shaky. The economy is very shaky. That would be the kind of achievement that I think Trump would like in his 3 years to go in power.
And how important is Marco Rubio in all this? Because at the beginning of the administration, there was, as we discussed earlier, this sort of vague outline of a deal, resources for staying in power in terms of Maduro. And then Marco Rubio gets involved and it becomes much more aggressive.
Well, I would say the whole Florida delegation feels that way. It's a Florida thing. It's Rubio, it's the White House Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, it's the senators and members of the House of Representatives from Florida. And again, that deal with Maduro would have done nothing on migration, which is another problem here. So I think, Maduro has the problem that there's enormous interest of Americans, of Venezuelan-Americans, of the Secretary of State in Venezuela.
And I know that, obviously this administration cares deeply about illegal migration across the border. I also know that a lot of Venezuelans that I spoke to in Florida who voted for Trump, who love Trump, are really upset by the number of Venezuelans in their community who've been sent packing back across the border, even if they weren't bad hombres, as the president might say. Is that something to do with it? Keep the Venezuelans happy because they really want Maduro to go. If you can do that, then they'll forgive you a few other things that have gone wrong. And of course, they matter in Florida because they vote in Florida. And although Florida is no longer a swing state, it could potentially swing back to the Democrats.
It's complicated because many of the Venezuelans in question are not yet citizens, so they can't vote. There's a complete contradiction or anomaly here. On the one hand, the president, the administration is saying Venezuela's hell. On the other hand, they're saying go back. It just, it makes no sense. I don't think very many people have been sent back, but the ones who are in Florida, of course, live in a kind of limbo, live in fear that they might be tomorrow morning. I think that was, frankly, a terrible move on the part of the president. You want to get rid of Maduro, get rid of Maduro. They can have a democratic regime, help them rebuild the economy, as in Argentina, and then you won't get these outflows. That's the way to do it, not grabbing people off the street and sending them back to Venezuela.
And of course, if you try some kind of regime change or whatever you want to call it, and it goes horribly wrong and you destabilize the country even more, instead of creating a safe place for them to return to, you might actually trigger an even greater outflow of Venezuelans that might end up coming to your country, the US.
Well, I think for those reasons and many others, I think the president should realize, he's halfway down the road here. Somebody's going to win this. It's going to be Nicolas Maduro or Donald Trump. One or the other is going to look triumphant in, 3 months, 6 months. And if the president thinks he can just sort of change his mind and pull back now and say, oh, never mind, I don't think that's going to work.
So finally then, Elliott, who is going to win this, do you think?
I would bet on Donald Trump.
And when?
Well, you can't keep that flotilla, including our largest aircraft carrier, in the Caribbean for a year. I mean, I'm thinking maybe not this year. There aren't that many weeks left this year. But 3 to 6 months, I'd say, is the window.
Springtime in Caracas.
See you there.
Okay. Elliott Abrams, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure.
You're welcome.
That's it for this week. We hope you enjoyed the show. We certainly did. And can I just urge you to subscribe to Trump World, to the podcast? It really makes a huge difference for us. And of course, you can always send your comments, your suggestions about questions to ask or topics to broach or, comments to make. I mean, we are all members of Trump World, let's face it. We're all citizens in Trump World, so let's make the most of it. From Anushka and me, that's it. See you next Wednesday.